I was born in 1956. I was born here in LA at a hospital called the French Hospital. Like a lot of people from the Latino community, I'm the child of immigrants. My parents were immigrants from Mexico. They immigrated first to El Paso, Texas, and then here to LA. And they came here in 1955, and I was born in 1956.
Can you remember any event that left an impact on you while you were a child?
There were several events that left impacts. The first, and probably the one that I remember the most, was going to school. When I was starting school in kindergarten in the first grade, I had never spoke English. Since I was a child of immigrant parents, we spoke Spanish and only Spanish at home. And so being in the classroom and essentially being in an environment where a foreign language was spoken was a difficult transition for me. There were a couple of other incidents that weren't particular to me, but I remember them very, very vividly, as if they were just a year ago. One was the assassination of JFK. I was in the second grade at the time, and I was going to a Catholic grammar school, and I'll never forget the principal, who was the Mother Superior of the order at the time, coming in, very emotionally shaken, visibly shaken, and crying and letting us know that President Kennedy had been assassinated. It was only later that I understood the significance of the fact that President Kennedy was the first Catholic president of the United States, and that we were in the middle of the Cold War, that his assassination carried so many geopolitical implications beyond simply his assassination. I also remember later on in the years 1968 and 69, which were very, very crucial years for America. 1968 was a year of a lot of upheaval. There were a lot of protests against the Vietnam War. There were some significant protests in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. And so it was a time of upheaval in America. And as a young child, you don't really appreciate it all, but you understand that things are not the status quo. In 1969, the United States was able to put a man on the moon, and everybody that was around at the time was glued to their television sets, a lot of which were still black and white at the time. Watching Neil Armstrong step down off that capsule and say one small step for man and one giant step for mankind is something that just about everybody remembers.
How was it growing up in Lincoln Heights?
Lincoln Heights was, at the time, I think the way it is now, it was a tough neighborhood. It was a poor and working class immigrant community, and historically it always has been that. And it was a neighborhood in transition. So you had to learn how to be careful, because it could be a very violent place, but it was also a very close-knit community with families that had been there and that were struggling and working hard to raise their children. So overall, it was a good experience.
How was the transition from Cathedral High School to Yale like?
It was like, it was quite a transition. It was like being a student in a foreign country. Cathedral High School was a good high school, but it certainly didn't have the academic curriculum or wasn't the powerhouse that Loyola High School is. And so I was not as well prepared to take on Yale, which at the time, as it is now, is the premier undergraduate institution in the world. And so it was an extremely difficult transition for me, being a kid from LA to go to New Haven, Connecticut at the age of 17 and having to compete with some of the brightest minds in the world was very, very difficult. But at the same time, it was of an incredible benefit to me. Yale opened up the world to me. There were people from literally every country in the world and every state in the United States that were students there. You learn how to grow up very, very quickly. And so, while it was a very difficult situation and a difficult experience to go through, it became less painful, if you will, every year as I gained greater familiarity and greater confidence with being at the university. And so it is probably the single most valuable experience that I've had in my life, and I consider myself very lucky to have gone to Yale.
What is one thing that you think has revolutionized the world as we know it, or your personal world over your lifetime? Explain.
Oh, that one is an easy one. There's no question about it. It's the invention of the computer. When I was a young person, a computer was unheard of, even though the first computer had already been invented, but was literally the size of this room, if not bigger. But even when I was in college, you did not have personal computers in widespread use, and computer programming was at its infancy. But clearly by the 80s and certainly by the 90s, the explosion of computer technology and the use of the internet changed the way that we communicate, both in terms of access to information and the speed with which we're able to access and transmit that information.